The air over the French countryside on May 21st, 1940, was a thick, choking cloud of diesel fumes and cordite as British Matilda tanks burst out of the mist and hedgerows, their tracks grinding over the torn earth at barely 12 miles an hour. Bullets were clanging and ricocheting off their nearly 80mm thick steel skin. Even the German 37mm anti-tank door-knocker rounds shattered upon impact with the Matilda's armor. Their prey? A German transport column moving westward, attempting to bypass the city of Arras to the south. Enemy infantry scattered in disbelief as the squat, slab-sided Matilda II's drove straight at them. The Germans were part of a 15-mile-long traffic jam of armored vehicles. The 7th Panzer Division, commanded by none other than General Major Erwin Rommel. The 7th Panzer Division had become famous as the Ghost Division and had just successfully smashed through the Ardennes, swept past Cambrai, and were racing confidently west towards the English Channel, exhibiting what was later called a reckless lack of tactical caution. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division had roughly 200 tanks in a column many kilometers long, with combat tanks concentrated toward the front and rear, and in the middle, motorized infantry in trucks towing artillery, 37mm anti-tank guns, signals units, fuel, ammo and supply trucks, and engineers in support vehicles. All were thin-skinned vehicles, creating a classic hinge point vulnerability. The Matildas were a part of Frankforce, a hastily assembled task force created for a single, urgent mission. The lives of 1/3 Allied soldiers lay in the balance. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and parts of the French army had been cut off from the rest of France. With German armor behind them and the sea ahead, withdrawal south was no longer possible. Evacuation by sea became the only realistic means of saving the force. On this day, May 21st, no evacuation plan of this scale had yet been approved or organized. Dunkirk had been selected as the egress point, but the port had been damaged by bombing, making it unsuitable for the docking of large ships. The Royal Navy needed time to designate embarkation routes, control marine traffic across the Channel, and requisition many hundreds of civilian vessels to take part in the evacuation. The BEF were busy holding a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk, while Luftwaffe aircraft bombed and strafed from above. German artillery pounded their positions from the perimeter, and German ground forces probed British defenses on the ground. As BEF forces defended Dunkirk and the beaches around it, the real danger was growing larger by the hour. German forces, who had reached the Channel, were strengthening and preparing to turn north and advance towards the evacuees, possibly forcing a mass surrender. Or worse. Between May 21st and 26th, this risk forced the British to act. Frankforce was the result. Named after its commander, Major General Harold Franklin, Frankforce was an improvised, combined arms formation with no formal organizational structure, no permanent staff, an ad hoc and temporary force with a single purpose: to strike south against the German flank, not to win decisively, but to buy time. Time the BEF desperately needed to organize what would become the evacuation at Dunkirk. Frankforce was created to strike south from Arras, disrupt German momentum, and force the enemy to pause, regroup, or divert forces. They were well south of Dunkirk and deliberately assembled in the area near Arras to strike the Germans. At Arras, the British were well positioned to strike the German advance before it could turn north in strength, forcing German units to stand and fight where they hadn't planned to. Worth noting, Frankforce was not dispatched to specifically engage Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. They were ordered to attack German forces in the Arras sector and create disruption. However, in a fortuitous case of right place, right time, the British encountered the weak midsection of Rommel's division at exactly the wrong moment for the Germans. Recognizing their moment of opportunity, the British attacked. When Frankforce's Matildas pushed into the German column, they overran anti-tank guns, caused confusion and panic, split parts of the column, and forced Rommel to personally intervene by ordering 88mm flak guns to be brought from the rear. But before they got there, the Matildas lumbered into the German column at roughly 12 miles per hour, with German 37mm anti-tank rounds bouncing harmlessly off them. The secret to the success of the Matildas was their armor, not necessarily their armaments. That said, the Matilda IIs were outfitted with quick-firing 2-pounders, 40mm anti-tank guns that launched armor-piercing rounds at a muzzle velocity of about 2,600 feet per second. This was perfect for knocking out enemy guns, destroying vehicles, and scattering German troops in terror. Exactly what the British intended. Frankforce was never intended to destroy the German advance or defeat a Panzer Division. Its purpose was to disrupt, confuse, and slow the German advance long enough to buy time for the evacuation being planned at Dunkirk. However, for several critical hours on 21st May 1940, British Matilda tanks advanced almost unopposed, shrugging off German fire as they pushed into the center of Rommel's column. Their armor made them unstoppable, briefly until German countermeasures took hold. But eventually, take hold they did. Rommel's 88mm guns arrived, making the tough Matilda skin no longer invulnerable. The 88mm Flak gun was originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, not a tank killer. But in 1940, it had 3 characteristics that made it decisive against the Matildas. Very high muzzle velocity, approximately 2,800 feet per second, large caliber, high energy projectiles, and flat trajectory at direct fire ranges. Even the robust hide of the Matilda was no match for this weapon. The 80s had been ordered to provide air defense at the rear of the column, but Rommel immediately dispatched them forward to engage the British tanks. Their barrels, aimed skyward as designed for anti-aircraft deployment, were lowered to horizontal, an unconventional use of these weapons in 1940 with devastating effect. These guns were capable of penetrating Matilda armor from over 1,000 yards away. Their first few direct hits shattered the illusion of invulnerability and stalled British momentum. The pendulum swung in favor of the Germans. British tank crews, realizing this, hesitated, and their attack lost coherence. Exposed to the devastating fire from the 80s and unable to effectively respond, the Matildas were forced to withdraw. German control of the battlefield was restored, and British freedom of movement decisively terminated. The British task force was forced to withdraw. Tank losses were significant. Historical accounts estimate about 24 tanks destroyed or disabled. Importantly, though, even in the face of tactical defeat, British withdrawal was orderly. Many crews and their equipment survived to fight another day. The important distinction is that technically, and according to military convention, Frankforce was defeated tactically at Arras, but succeeded strategically. The distraction and disruption that the British forces created achieved the intended purpose, which was to break German momentum, shake the confidence of German high command, and gain time for the Allied troops at Dunkirk. The Battle of Arras rattled the Germans all the way up to Hitler. 3 days after Arras, Hitler approved a halt of panzer forces short of Dunkirk. To be clear, This was not a direct result of the British attack at Arras, but the encounter with Frankforce was enough to reinforce fears about the 7th Panzer Division being overextended and exposed, something that German senior commanders were already worried about. This forgotten battlefield teaches us that despite being a small improvised formation, weaker on paper and never intended to defeat the German advance, the soldiers of Frankforce disrupted Rommel's overextended column at a critical moment, helping slow German momentum and buying the time needed to organize the evacuation of nearly 1/3 of a million Allied soldiers from Dunkirk. The Battle of Arras did not save Dunkirk, but without Arras, the evacuation might not have been possible. The loss of the British Expeditionary Force would have stripped Britain of its only field army and placed the very decision to continue the war in doubt.